All right, today we're jumping into a really fascinating piece of history with our explainer, Manifest Destiny, the Northern Shadow.
And we're going to kick things off with a question that, sounds a little out there. How on earth did a U.S. war with Mexico end up helping to create Canada? It's a wild story of ambition, fear, and some seriously unintended consequences. So let's get into it.
To really get our heads around this, we first have to understand this powerful idea that was driving everything in America during the 19th century, this concept of a divine mission.
And that mission, it had a name, Manifest Destiny. This was this widespread, deeply held belief that the United States was basically chosen by God to expand and take over the entire North American continent. It wasn't just a policy idea. For many, it was destiny itself.
This quote here really captures the incredible scale of that ambition. Many Americans believed that it was their nation's manifest destiny to expand and occupy all of the North American continent. Not some of it, all of it.
And you gotta know, this wasn't some newfangled idea that just popped up in the 1840s. Nope. For a lot of people in the U.S., conquering the lands to the north, what would eventually become Canada, was just unfinished business left over from the American Revolution.
So, you've got this powerful idea, this ambition that's been simmering for decades. But when does it stop being just talk? When does it become a threat that makes the colonies up north genuinely start to sweat? Well, that's when the threat became very, very real.
This right here is the absolute turning point. The American-Mexican War in 1846 is the moment Manifest Destiny stopped being a slogan people shouted at political rallies and became forcible action. It was proof, in steel and blood, that the U.S. was absolutely willing to go to war to expand its borders.
And just look how fast it all happened. In the 1840s, Manifest Destiny is a popular idea. By 1846, it's the reason for a full-blown war. And just 2 years later, by 1848, the U.S. has annexed a huge chunk of Mexico. If you're watching this from the British colonies, the message could not have been clearer. The main takeaway here is that the United States had just proven to the entire world, and especially to its northern neighbors, that it had both the military muscle and the political willpower to take territory by force. The threat was no longer some abstract idea. It was real.
And we're not just talking about a general threat. Things were actually getting pretty heated right there along the border. What's so interesting here is that you can see these specific flashpoints that made the danger feel immediate and personal. You had things like the Trent Affair, the St. Albans raid, and then the Fenian raids, where Irish-American nationalists literally launched invasions from U.S. soil. Every single one of these incidents just highlighted how vulnerable the separate, scattered colonies really were.
And all this created this stark, dramatic contrast. On one side of the border, you've got leading American politicians just openly, publicly talking about invading and annexing the British colonies. And on the other side, you've got the colonies, and even officials back in London living with this constant, nagging fear of a full-scale American takeover.
Now, this fear wasn't spread out evenly. There was one specific region that pretty much everyone saw as the most likely and the easiest target for American expansion, and that was the West.
That main target was a huge territory called Rupert's Land. It was a massive piece of the continent, and let me tell you, American expansionists were looking at it with very hungry eyes.
And when I say massive, I am not kidding. Look at that number, almost 4 million square kilometers. An absolutely enormous, resource-rich territory just sitting there.
So what was its biggest weakness? Well, for a territory that huge, it was incredibly thinly populated. And that, right there, was the whole problem. It was like an open door, a vacuum that American settlers could just pour into, which would make annexation almost a foregone conclusion. So, when you're faced with a threat like that, a powerful expansionist neighbor on one side and a huge, vulnerable territory on the other, the scattered colonies were forced to think about a pretty radical new idea. This created what our sources call a compelling need to unite.
This quote really gets to the core of it. The vulnerability of the West created a compelling need for the colonial leaders to do something. They had to secure that land, to claim it, and get their own people in there before the Americans did it for them.
And this is the ultimate connection, right? The idea of confederation, of uniting all the colonies into a single country, wasn't just some nice political theory. The perception of the United States as a very real threat was a powerful, powerful catalyst that literally pushed the colonies together. So if you break it down, the path to creating a nation becomes crystal clear. Step 1, you have a credible military threat of U.S. expansion. Step 2,
You have the painful realization that as a bunch of small, separate colonies, you're just too weak to defend yourselves. Which leads you, logically, to step 3. You create a brand new political setup to unite for common defense.
Let's just put it as plainly as possible. The union of the British North American colonies, the very creation of Canada, was in large part a direct defensive response to the threat of being swallowed whole by their powerful southern neighbor.
Which leaves us with a final really fascinating question to think about. When you look at all the evidence, was Canada born from a shared positive vision for a new nation? Or was it forged in the fire of a common fear?